So, good afternoon, and welcome to another installment of our ongoing nonprofit leadership and engagement education series. I am Joanne Nazer, nonprofit leadership and engagement manager here at the Washington County Community Foundation. Thank you for joining us today with our content expert about crisis communication. Just want to encourage everyone to mute themselves, please. Not Tim, though. I'm so excited about this session. It is my honor to introduce Tim O'Brien with O'Brien Communications. He has provided crisis communications and issues management support to clients from Fortune 100 companies and national nonprofits to emerging startup groups. He has published a book, which we see on the screen there, The Essential Crisis Communication Plan, that I have read. It's such a practical and excellent blueprint. Never endorsed a book here before, Tim, but it's such a practical thing. And Tim was kind to donate a few copies to the foundation. And thanks so much for presenting today, Tim. And we appreciate your work.
No problem. Thank you, Joanne. Do you want me to get started now?
Yeah, please.
Sure.
Yeah,
that book that Joanne mentioned, I gave her a handful of copies. So if anyone wants to get a copy of it, we're not going to make a competition or anything out of it. It's just that if you want a copy, just send an email to Joanne, and she'll be able to give them out on a first come, first served basis. And I will try. This is a relatively short presentation that I want to leave time for questions and answers. So I don't want to go too fast through the slides, but there are just a handful of slides here, and I'll walk through them, and then I'll be able to take your questions from there. So the book itself is not just what I talk about. The book is really a summary of what I've worked on for decades, and it's basically what happens is if you call me and you have a crisis, what are we going to do if there is no plan? How are we going to tackle this? If something happens and it happens out of the blue for you, and you need someone like me to come in and try to put some process to it, well, that's pretty much what that book is it's that process. It's what happens when, in a sense, when there is no plan on your end, but it's always my plan. So that's what that is, and I'll get into more detail about that. So a little background on me. I started my career back in the day at KDKA TV and radio. I worked there for a while, and then I transitioned into PR, crisis management, media coaching, media relations, and media strategy, and I've pretty much done that ever since. So it's been over 40 some years since I did that. So I worked for 10 years for a company called Ketchum. They're still one of the largest PR firms in the world. They started in Pittsburgh, and I worked in the Pittsburgh office for 10 years, and that's where I did a lot of my first major crisis work at Ketchum. I started my own business in 2001 after working for a broadband company for 4 years. And every step of the way since I was at Ketchum until today, I've always had my hand in crisis work. So it's been quite a bit, and those crises have evolved over the years. So when you have a crisis, and this is kind of in the book, but it's also just in general advice on my part, and that is, you don't want there to be no planning. You basically, you can't wing it, and that's what a lot of firms and a lot of nonprofits have to do because they don't have budgets for certain things. But you still don't want to wing it. You want to do whatever you can to prepare for a crisis, even if you don't have these big budgets that these large companies have. You're not going to do well by hoping it goes away. And you'll never do well by telling people what you think they want to hear, even if they tell you what they want to hear. And the classic example is when someone tells you they want you to apologize. Even if they tell you that, don't think that an apology is really what they want to hear or going to solve your problem. And sometimes, if all you do is go in and tell them what the lawyers want you to say, you may mitigate the risk of legal exposure, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to help you in a communication sense. So don't strictly tell them what the lawyers want you to say. But I want to make sure to say, qualify that, because I never do anything without consulting the lawyers before we say it. So I would never advise going outside the legal review process. Never. You're always helping yourself and helping your organization by making sure that everything goes through legal review and that you're all on the same page. But by that same token, you just can't let the lawyers alone drive the process, because you could end up hurting yourself in other ways. So what do you don't want to micro plan. This is something, if anybody on this call has seen articles or talked to people about crisis communications, they might suggest that you have, and this is old fashioned, binders full of outdated documents, lists of vendors and lists of suppliers and donors and volunteers and all the different people. And you don't know how old those lists are, but you have them in binders or you have them on computers, Excel spreadsheets. And you have that, but you don't know when the last time was they were checked and updated. So you don't want that. You don't want template documents for news releases. You don't want to write a news release today about a possible, financial problem or a possible social media problem that could happen at any time. Some people in my field will tell you to do that, and they'll say you do that because then when the crisis happens, you don't have to worry about how to get started. But in my experience, no one ever uses them whenever a crisis happens. No one even looks at them. So you wasted all this time a year ago or 2 years ago writing these template news releases that you're never going to use. And in the process, you had this false sense of security. So I don't even advise doing that. And the other thing is that traditional crisis communications person might tell you is, here's the process. And that's not what I say at all. I don't want to say, here's the process, because that means I'm asking you to follow my process and not processes that already exist in your organization. And what I try to do is say, well, how do we have a plan that works with your processes? And we'll get into detail on that. You want customized planning. You want a short, workable, modular plan that breaks down into 60-minute units. What I mean by that is, basically, you want a plan that goes into action immediately and goes for the next 60 minutes. And then it repeats itself in 60 minutes. And then it repeats itself in the next 60 minutes and so on. It's a modular plan, and it evolves. It's not like you're doing the same thing every hour. You're doing new things every hour, but you're following the same plan every hour, and it becomes a cycle. It's the system and the process that you already follow. So what it does, it assumes you will take the lead and not hope that it fades away, the crisis. And it trains key players in the process according to your organization. In my world, you always want to have a team captain for crisis communications. That's not the CEO or the executive director. It's usually the person who's charged with communication, sort of like a quarterback, someone that is given responsibility to coordinate everything. And that team captain could be the spokesperson, or the spokesperson could be the head of the organization. More likely, that's what it is, especially in a nonprofit. And that would be the CEO, the executive director, or the president, someone like that. Crisis planning is a year-round process, and it doesn't need to be a chore. It just needs to be part of your routine. And what I mean by that is, when you have someone always sort of asking certain questions in routine meetings, that's how it becomes a year-round process. So an example would be if someone is giving an update in one of your meetings and they say, we're having funding donor issues this year. We're not up to our goals in getting donations or membership. And that might be a little thing, but someone who's thinking like a crisis manager would ask, what are you doing to fix it? Is this better or worse than last year? Do you expect that it's going to become a bigger problem? And how will that affect our overall finances? Will there need to be cuts later on this year in some way or another? Those are the types of questions that cross your mind long before the actual crisis happens. And you start to monitor those things so that when it does get to the point where, oh yeah, we had to announce that we didn't reach our goals this year for these things, but here's what we're doing to correct it. You've had months to think about that and think about how you're going to approach it, not just wait for your accountant or your, CPA or your treasurer to come and tell you at the last minute, this is the month we're going to have to announce something because we're having this problem. So there are usually warning signs, and you just have to be attuned to those things and start thinking about how you might have to deal with them well in advance of doing it. I looked at a lot of crisis plans over the years, and the one that's in my book it is my crisis plan. It's the core of it, and it's adjusted for every organization that I've worked with, and it's different even now. I started doing this over 25 years ago this way, and I still see most crisis plans do it the way I don't like. I don't want to say the old way because most people still do it, so it's not old, but I just don't like it. And so what a lot of crisis plans try to do is institute these new processes for your organization. So they come in and say, you're going to need a crisis team of everybody on your senior management team. Well, that sounds good. And in an ideal world, that's the way it should work. But that may not be the way your organization makes decisions. Then the person might create templates. I talked about that. And then they might say, well, let's do formal research on opinions and attitudes of people. Let's do surveys or focus groups if we have time. And also, why don't we do have this review process? We're going to need this person to look at it and that person to look at it, and before we do anything. Well, you might have a more streamlined organization where there's 2 or 3 people who pretty much make all the key decisions. And you may also already wait until you have the facts before you're writing. So that might be something that you do. You don't need templates. You want to make sure that whenever you do write something, you write it based on what's happening at the moment. You may already know your own stakeholders, and that's key. So you may not need to do formal research or focus groups or opinions and attitudes because you're so plugged into them. And you may have your own existing review and approval process that isn't the same that this outside consultant wants you to follow. And so what I usually would do is try to find these things out on the right column first. What is your process for making decisions? How do you like what's your comfort zone on having documents written? Do you want them written in advance or not? I still don't advise templates, but there are different ways to, ease your comfort, ease your concerns, and make you more comfortable if that's what it takes. And then how well do you know your stakeholders? And not just that, but how do you stay in touch with them? Typically, organizations have processes they don't even think about, but they do. We have this meeting every month. We talk to their members this way. We have all different ways that we try to stay in touch. We have a membership director that does regular outreach. Well, then all of a sudden that membership director is key to our process because they're an intelligence gathering channel for us. So there's so many different ways that that I would want to learn about the organization before customizing a crisis plan for them. And it's all based on the answers to those questions on that right column. These are some of the types of crises you will face if you're running into crises. I'm sure some of you can tell me I'm missing a few here based on some that you might have already faced. But the kinds you might face are workforce issues like harassment, theft, or violence. You might have legal issues like litigation, a regulatory violation, or non-compliance issue. Social media issues are always, they can affect any organization. Rogue posts from employees, donors, constituents, members, families of people that you deal with. I've worked with nursing homes, and one of the biggest vulnerabilities nursing homes have is when a family member comes into the site and they take pictures or they conduct posts and they attack the organization, and you have to find out if it's true or not, and then take it from there. Activist attacks, oftentimes they're baseless allegations, and you can't assume they're baseless allegations. I can't, but I want to make sure that I verify everything and know what I'm talking about and can vouch for my client. But on top of that, oftentimes you find out they're baseless. And the last thing I tell my clients to do, if you're accused of something that has no grounds, is to apologize and try to admit fault to make it go away, which is what some people will say to do. I never do that, and I never suggest it. It doesn't solve anything. You could have in your sector, I'm sure, a major crisis is any kind of loss of funding or funders or members or people like that. And negative media coverage is always a vulnerability for any crisis. This is one slide that covers a few pages in the book and in my plans, and that is what's your initial strategy meeting. This is a chart or a graphic, but it's basically it represents the questionnaire that we follow. It's almost an agenda for that first meeting, and I'll talk about it in a specific example. I was working for a company that lost its chairman on a Sunday morning, and we brought our key members of our team in on Sunday afternoon, and we went through my agenda, my questionnaire, which is summarized here. And basically, it was just me doing a download from everybody around the table. What do we know? What do we know? What internally, externally? What happened? What's going to happen? Who does this affect? How does it affect them? A long list of questions, but we went through the whole thing in an hour, 60 minutes. And at the end of that hour, the way the thing's structured, and it's that way in that book, is you realize, because it's all on paper then at the end of an hour, how severe is the crisis, who's affected. You almost know by the end of that process, before the hour's up, who do we need to talk to, what do we need to say, what do they need to hear, what are their concerns, how are we going to get out or reach out to them, what channels are most important, who are the most important people to deal with different people. So if it's members, should it be our CEO, should it be our membership director, should if it's the public, how does that affect them, who should talk to them, what do they need to hear, what are their questions going to be. All of that you try to cover in that first hour, and by the end of that hour, then again you kind of know what you need to do next, and you follow that up hour by hour, and you just keep updating the same process until you resolve the crisis whenever it happens. One of the things that is really important to do in the beginning of a crisis, and someone who's a crisis manager does this almost instinctively, is where is the crisis and who is it affecting and how severe is it. And that tells you basically, it's kind of like if someone says you have cancer, you want to know, do I have stage 4 cancer or stage 1, early stage cancer? So that's kind of what this is. It's like, where is the problem and how bad can it be? And in this case, it's a pyramid, but the most important and critical part is the bottom, not the top. It's the foundation of the organization, which is your reputation from a communications point of view. And that is, if your organization's reputation is threatened, that's a pretty severe crisis. But at the top, if the issue is some sort of miscommunication, then that can be more easily remedied, and it's a shorter duration crisis, so long as you get the communication right. And if you do some of these things wrong, it gets worse until it does affect the reputation. So if the crisis affects, let's say, a package on a consumer product, and there's poor labeling on it, and somebody burns themselves with coffee, like McDonald's, then you fix the labeling, and then you communicate that, and you communicate inside your organization on how hot the coffee needs to be, and you solve the problem, and your reputation is never really affected. The public looks at it as an operational problem, something you fixed. Now, when you get to the bottom, organization's reputation. If you have a CEO who extorts money or embezzles money from somebody, and now criminal charges are, now the whole character of the organization is put at play, and you have to look at things in a whole different way. It could be a more lasting and more severe crisis, and it's good to kind of see that from the outset, because then you know what you have to do. It determines who's going to be in the meetings sometimes, and it also determines what you need to say and how you need to say it. And then in between, the quality is like, is the quality of your services, or your, usually in nonprofits, your services affected by whatever's happening? Uh, are your systems flawed? Is there a systemic problem that is explains the reason why you're having a quality or a communications problem? And then people, if you have high turnover, or you have trouble with certain parts of your organization having the kinds of people you need, and that's where a lot of your problems stem from, then you know that's a people problem, and it's a serious problem. But again, if you fix that, it doesn't creep down to where the organization's reputation's affected. And then you have institutional ethics. That's a big category, because if the organization only cares about certain things, and those things are in conflict with general ethics or other people's ethics, then all of a sudden you have an ethical issue, which gets you closer to your reputation. So ethical issues become reputational issues pretty quick. We talk about messaging a lot, and that becomes an issue when you go through the worksheet. And after the first hour of the crisis, you start saying, well, what do we need to say to who? And this is just an example, but it's a message mapping worksheet that we use. And it's, you list on the left side who the most important people are to your plan, your stakeholders. And then you think about what's their chief concern, not what they need to hear. What are they worried about? What do they, when they hear the news of whatever we want to talk about, what are they going to first worry about? And then you have to think, well, what do they need to know in relation to that? And we're not BSing anybody. We're basically saying they have a real concern, or maybe it's an overblown concern. But what do we need to say to address it? Treat it seriously and legitimately, and that's, and what do they need to know to either dispel the myths, or to validate their concerns and tell them what we're going to do about it? So what they need to know, and then what they want to know, and then you come up with your own key message, which is based on the facts and everything else here in context. So that's a very key part of the process. Last two slides here, and I'm going to explain them. They're Mike Tyson was a boxer, retired now, and he had one. This is probably the one quote, if they ever say, what did he ever say that was so profound, this is the one everybody will point to. And when he said it, he said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And that's true. That goes back to those templates that I talked about. You can think you're all buttoned down. Then when the crisis happens, you'll find out if you really did have a plan. But then again, there was Chuck Noll, my favorite football coach of all time. And he had a different take on it. He said, leaving the game plan is a sign of panic, and panic is not in our game plan. So in other words, he's basically saying, we know the worst can happen. We're going to plan for the worst. And when the worst does happen, the first, we know the worst thing we can do is panic. So we're not going to do that. That's just not something we're going to do. We're going to stick to the plan, follow the process. And he did pretty well with that philosophy. So I really liked, but both of these are true. Both of these statements are true. So it's not like one invalidates the other. So that's that. I can now and take any questions anyone has.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. I think that was very valuable and timely presentation. So I appreciate that. And if people want to put in questions in the chat or raise your hand, we can go to that. But I like how you said in the book that, there can be awkward and uncomfortable conversations. Um, like if, and we've heard of several organizations and businesses going through some struggles right now. But you have to have some of these uncomfortable conversations as you plan. And you talked about warning signs. Can you share any warning signs that, giving your expertise that you have seen over the years?
I'll try to apply it to nonprofits, but I mentioned the financial ones, and those are sometimes the easiest. And whenever I've been involved with an organization and they've said to me, we have our team meetings on Mondays, or we have quarterly meetings like this. And I don't do all crisis work. So even though I might be working for an organization and they have no crisis, and they say to me, you know what, we have this monthly Zoom call. Do you want to be on it? I usually say yes, because that gives me a way to put my finger on the pulse of what's going on. And I am thinking these ways. I'm thinking, what are the good things we can talk about? What are the good things for the communications process? But then I'm also thinking, wait a second, that membership director said they missed their goals last month, I'll just take a mental note of that. It's not an
Mhm.
issue, but I'll just take a mental note of that, and at some point maybe ask some people, was that serious or not? Is it routine? Is it seasonal? So those are the types of things that are warning signs typically. And you can usually go by group. You might even say, somebody might say, you know what, our lease is up at the end of the year, and we're looking for a new location because we're either outgrowing this or it's becoming too expensive for us and we don't need all this space. It's one or the other sometimes. And I even had a school at one point that was changing unions, so they thought it was no problem. They had one union doing their janitorial work and they were switching to another union. But the union that was losing the contract made it a crisis for the organization. So even though operationally it wasn't a crisis because they were going to still have janitors and they were still going to have union, they weren't going non-union. But at the same time, the union that was losing the contract decided, uh-oh, and they used the guerrilla tactics to smear the board of members of the nonprofit and the school. And so we had to. So when they first when I first talked to them about that situation, that itself was a warning sign. They said, we don't think this is going to be an issue because we're staying union. And then we put a plan together, and it happened the way I was afraid. They had you had the one union go crazy, and so you just start basically listening, keep your ear to the ground and listening. I'm sure everybody on the call, I looked at your list of people who are on the call today. These are people who are experienced people in the organizations where they are. They know their organizations. And I think when something's just not right, that's a good time to sort of take note, not to change anything right away, not to panic, but just something to say, we got to keep an eye on that. And maybe now's a good time to talk to my marketing director about this. And then when the marketing director's in that meeting, they might say, you know what, let's draft up something. We're gonna put some solicitations out, and let's bring legal into it, and those kind of things. So you start to just try to get ahead of those things early, but it usually starts out as routine business.
So, Tim, I know you say it with KDKA radio, and you do have a calm voice. So, how can people stay calm in a crisis? And another thing, I just wanted to digress a minute and said, Tim always, I'm going to quote you believe in communication, and it may not be what people want to hear, or they may feel what they don't want to hear. So, how do you stay calm and yet still communicate effectively?
For me, it's preparation. I mean, the more prepared you are, the more calm you can be. Uh, uh, Whenever I go in to a client cold, uh, I try to get a feel for the situation and then paint two pictures. One is the worst case scenario, and one is the best case scenario, and then try to work towards the best case. But when you know what the worst case scenario is, that can be calming. And the reason it can be calming is because you know how bad it can get, and you work against that, and you work away from that. So
Mhm.
it's kind of like if you're in a boat and you're hitting the rapids, you know where the rapids are. You want to get away from them. So the further you away from them you can get, the better. And that's calming. And so to me, that's how I feel about it. Is that communication's key for internally within the organization. If people aren't communicating, and people are guarding their turf within the organization and they're protecting information, or if the leader of the organization just is not kept informed on certain things and that you get blindsided. Some I haven't run into too much, but certain cultures are like that. And when those cultures happen like that, you have this perpetual, like a hamster wheel of drama, and
Mhm.
little things turn into big things too routinely. And that doesn't calm me down at all. It's a I don't know, I'm a control freak, so so when I see that kind of stuff, my instinct is to say, what can we do to put an end to that? And it's usually communication, more open communication.
Well, Tim, I think it's great you're a control freak. I think that's what you need in this in your consultancy. So the other thing is that, as you said, and we have a diverse group of nonprofits on the call, from larger to smaller to all volunteer. And do you have any general recommendations for, let's say, our smaller nonprofits?
I would say in general, and that was who I was thinking of when I talked earlier about your processes. Is you're not going to have an HR director and this director and that. You're going to have, and even if you have on paper 10 people, chances are two or three are doing everything, and and that's your process. So I would say for them, it's like usually you have your two or three people that have to be on the same page as much as possible, have to be communicating as much as possible, and just start to think, okay, can can this can this unravel in any way, and how do we prevent that now? That way, it doesn't. My goal is don't let it become a crisis, but and usually that happens. Someone like me doesn't have to even get involved because you have the management team dealing with these things all the time. and
Mhm.
uh, and and as a personal thing too, I think it's worth mentioning at this point, because I'm not trying to sell a book because I don't make I don't I am, I guess, trying to sell a book because I wrote it, but I'm not making any money from the book. And there's a reason I wrote the book, and it was this: I was working for a pharmaceutical company back in the '90s, and they had a crisis plan. That the table of contents started on page 36. That was what I write about here, and I thought, this is ridiculous, and it's written the way we're supposed to, but it's layers upon layers of everything. And I asked my client, I said, would you mind if I tried to condense this down to something like 25 pages? And he said, sure, give it a shot. And I did, and they liked it. And it was basically this book in its early stage. And then after that, every time I worked for a company or organization, when we did a crisis plan, I used that core structure to customize it for whoever. And I've done it ever since. And then about 3 years ago, 4 years ago, I thought, I'm getting to the point in my career where I don't want to do these anymore. It can be really labor intensive and time intensive. And I thought, what I'm going to do is take my crisis plan, genericize it, and put it into a book. That way, when I decide that I'm going to hang it up one of these days, the book's sitting out there on Amazon and somebody can benefit from it. And it's not sitting in a drawer in my office. So that's really all this book really is it's a crisis plan that you can give to your marketing director who might not have any experience, and it's not that hard to follow, and they can read it, and they can, I don't have any pride of ownership here, they can take it and put it in their own computer and make a plan out of it, and hopefully it helps them so that they're not sitting there thinking we have to go hire a communications firm to at least have a start of a crisis plan. They can at least use that here.
Well, I'm going to plug it again. And so, yes, it's available on Amazon for those who aren't going to receive it when the foundation sends the copies out. But it's very practical and down to earth. And I gave it to our marketing manager, a copy. So I think one of the things you also suggest in the book is that everyone has some type of media training, although you just really focus on the spokesperson.
Yeah, the media training and the spokesperson. I think that's kind of where everybody likes to go, and they should go there. It's what everybody can get a handle on. Uh, there's a philosophy: do we protect the CEO or not? And and uh, and that doesn't mean you hide the CEO from the public, but sometimes a problem doesn't rise to that level, or sometimes the CEO is so involved in contracts and non-disclosure agreements that you don't want the CEO front and center because someone might ask them a question and for legal reasons they're not at liberty to even talk about it. It could be a human resources matter. It could be somebody accusing the organization or suing the organization for harassment or something. And the CEO is vulnerable when they talk to the media because there's a lot they can't talk about for legal reasons.
Right.
So that's the
Mhm.
protect the CEO part of it. And so you have to look at who needs to speak and why, and uh, and and you try to do it that way. I like to go with the most high up person as possible to be the spokesperson, unless there's these other issues. It's the opposite of I you put the low person out there just because. No, I like to go with the high person out there and just knock the crisis out soon. But if you can't, if you can't put that person out there for vulnerability reasons, for legal reasons, then you find the best subject matter expert, they say, to do it. So it could be a
Mhm.
lawyer if it's a legal issue. It could be an accounting issue. Oftentimes, if you have a really good marketing or communications person, they can be that person. It just depends on trust within the organization.
One thing I also found interesting in the book, Tim, is that you talk about being emotional. As an emotional person, I must say myself. And when you're in crisis mode, a lot of emotions can come out. But as I said, you have a calm demeanor. How can you get the correct balance? How about that?
I think when people are emotional, there's a reason for it. There's a concern under it, underlying it. So you have to find out what is that concern and address it and try to do it preemptively. So if it's layoffs, that's a common
Hmm.
thing. And it's not uncommon for a group of managers to be in a meeting talking about layoffs. In the back of their own minds are thinking, well, I'm not part of this layoff because I'm in this meeting, but I could be next. So there's an emotional aspect of that. And it's true. It's legitimate. So it's a
Hmm.
legitimate concern. And I think I can't alleviate that, especially if I'm a consultant. All I can do is kind of be aware of it. But you have to be aware of that kind of stuff. That if you're the executive director of the nonprofit, you have to know that everybody sitting around this table is they're doing their job, but they're also wondering if they're next. If it's a
Hmm.
layoff and
Sure.
things like that, and or even if it's a legal settlement, people are thinking, well, that's going to hit our bottom line. How's that going to affect my job? There's always that. So you kind of have to think really, the way you said that to deal with the emotions is to think about the worst, think about what needs to be done, and somebody sometimes has to be elected or nominated or trusted to be the person to go to senior management and ask these questions. I was talking to a CEO one time. We were going to do a big layoff, and he had a town meeting after the layoffs happened, and so he had the meeting with the all staff meeting, and I said to him, there's a lot of people here that are going to worry about their jobs now because even they don't know if it's over. And his answer to me was, well, they're not going to have the guts to ask me about that. And I thought, okay, I have to rethink this. So
Mhm.
so I went back and I wrote up all the questions that I thought he needed to answer, but and I thought he needed training on that, but he wasn't going to take training because of what he just said. So I thought, okay, I'm going to field some questions on this. So I'm going to go and ask him to coach me. And so I put all the questions that I knew he was going to get, and I said, hey, can you coach me on these 6 questions because They're going to ask me if their job's next. They're going to ask, people are going to take me off to the side because they won't want to talk to you. This,
Mhm.
and this. And so we worked through the processes. And when he said something that I thought was a little too blunt, I said, well, I don't quite understand that. Can we try it a different way? Because I don't want to be that way. I don't want to be that blunt. And what I was really doing was coaching him. and and
Good, Tim. Good.
and and then it worked out because we had that all
Mhm.
team meeting, and he did get some of those questions. And I don't even know if he realized it, but what he did realize was, having that conversation with me beforehand, he felt a little bit more prepared. And so sometimes you go in the front door, sometimes you're in the back door, but either way, you're ready.
Thank you. So I just want to say that the foundation and the capacity building grant cycle is open currently, and one of the strategic priority areas is strategic planning. And now that we've talked, we survived 2025, yay, and just with scenario planning, making things shorter, uh, timeframes like maybe 18 months, maybe 2 years, not necessarily 3 to 5 as they talk about anymore, but that we do focus on what is the worst thing that can happen to the organization. Does somebody die, lose all the funding, things like that? And so I would encourage all the nonprofits here to look at that. And Jeff Zollers, do you have a question for us?
Actually, I appreciate you allowing me to speak just for a moment, and because I want to express my appreciation to Joanne and to Tim, because this it's interesting that Joanne recommended this book to me this past week, and I read through it, right through it, and I have to tell you that if you were in the middle of a crisis, this is, and I'm promoting the book. It's an excellent book for addressing that. And one of the things that you said, Tim, is that you didn't like templates, but what's nice is that you create this universal guideline that can apply to many different crises that would happen with an organization. And I just wanted to take a moment. There's a couple of key points in your book that were very helpful for us over our crisis in the last couple of weeks. One of the things that you included in your book were when you do the information gathering, the self-assessment questions.
Mm.
Those are from page 42 forward. Those are really good for covering all the bases and making sure that you do not leave anything out, so I mean, every time you leave something out, it's going to come back to haunt you later. And I think that these questions are very helpful. The other thing that we found useful too was on page 64, your components of the initial statement, making sure that you keep all of those components, or at least most of them that are applicable in your initial statement that you send out. Now, my question is that to you, Tim, is that and I mentioned this, I think, in an email. Sometimes there are extenuating circumstances when it comes to addressing a crisis and the way that you would communicate information out. Now, one of the modes that I used, the method that I used, is that when you're looking at the stakeholders in your organization, and I was able to put them in a tiered sequence as far as a sort of a concentric way of expressing the information to them, putting the priorities to the major donors, the higher, and wanting to meet with them in person rather than sending a statement out, and then concentrically going outward to our membership, and then the last would be the public that we would go to in social media. Now, when you have a situation, when you have a crisis that your organization is facing that has legal issues in which there is an active investigation, where we found it difficult was trying to tailor our message that so that it would not impact an ongoing investigation, both in who we speak to, which one of our stakeholders, and to what degree we would share the information, and also the timing of releasing that information. Now, an attorney would suggest perhaps waiting until charges are filed before releasing a public statement. I'm curious, from your experience with working with so many organizations, what have you found to be the optimal way to approach this?
Well, always err on the side of taking legal advice and working out from there, but don't take it as marching orders. Uh, this is not the way it is. The way it is today is not the way it used to be with lawyers. Today, if you talk to a lawyer, you can have a nice conversation. They'll tell you these are non-negotiable. These are things that I will talk to you about, what you can do. That's usually what I have with lawyers today. I can remember years ago, just the notion of communicating became a dispute between everybody who's not a lawyer and the lawyer in the room. The lawyer just didn't want you to communicate at all, and so that's really
No
changed.
comment, right? No comment. We didn't talk about that. No comment.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt him.
Nope. Yeah, and so I remember those days, but in so I think for starters, I defer to legal to know what we shouldn't do and can't do, because the last thing I want to do is create a worse situation because you communicated. And sometimes you really can't comment. And people in my business will say, you can't say no comment. That's an admission of guilt. And sometimes you have to say, in so many words, we can't comment on that because it's a risk. So, but on the other hand, you can usually say no comment without saying the words no comment. You can say, here's what we're looking into. Here's what the investigation's going to cover. Here's what there is an investigation. If you can confirm that, a lawyer might say you don't even want to confirm that. But if something's public, you can say, this is a personnel matter, where if it is a personnel matter, and we can't comment on active personnel investigations. It's just a matter of policy out of respect to privacy to the employee, to the people involved, whatever. And you can say all those things without ever getting into the discussion of what is actually being alleged, and if you can't talk about that. But if the person alleges, and this is a hypothetical, but if a person is on social media and they allege something, my boss harassed me or something like that, that may or may not be true. Uh, you can the last thing you want to do in a communications, this is a spokesperson media training thing too, don't repeat the accusation against you. So if someone says my supervisor harassed me, and that's why I quit and that's why I'm suing, uh, you don't know that if you don't know that that's true, you're doing an investigation on it. You don't say she alleges that her supervisor harassed her. You don't say that, because you're repeating the allegation. You're perpetuating the problem. If it is, but you say, we understand the seriousness of the allegations against our managers, but this is a personnel matter and we are doing an investigation and we are trying to protect the privacy. But I can promise you, we are doing all the right things with legal counsel and all. And if there's a regulatory aspect of it, same thing. We're reporting this to so-and-so, we're working with so-and-so. You want to be as transparent as you can on the process, but what you're talking about is the process, not about the allegations. So you're saying, here's the process for how we're going to deal with this problem. But you're never saying what the problem is or whether it's true or not or all those types of things. So you're that goes to my hierarchy with that pyramid. You're moving the discussion further away from the organization's reputation, and you're moving it to talking about process or systems. And if something bad did happen already, and you kind of know that, someone got injured on the job or a volunteer got injured volunteering, and you can say, you know what, we are investigating our processes. This is, we do have certain processes right now, but we might need to revisit them. Well, a reporter might say, or somebody might say, well, what are those processes for safety? Well, then you want to have those documents handy so that you can share them with whoever you need to, or summarize them in a statement or something like that. So the key point there is focus on the process, and what that forces your audiences to do is become a little bit more objective. When you move people into discussion of process, they're starting to give you a fair shake now, and they're saying, oh, I see, this could be they don't think this could be a process issue, but what they are thinking is, well, it might not be the CEO's fault. There might have been miscommunication between this person and that person or whatever. So I find it almost by default for me, I like to go to process, and that is what processes were in effect to prevent this, and what processes are in effect to correct it. And are these processes working, or do they need to be revisited? Because we can always talk about that typically. And I found that lawyers have no problem with that either. If you have all the right qualifiers in there, because if you say worst case scenario is if you say, well, we had a bad process and an employee lost a finger, then all of a sudden you're getting sued and on the grounds of something that you communicated that we had a process that was flawed and that resulted in an employee injury. So that goes back to you will work with your lawyers, but you tend to do better when you talk about process and keep it at that level.
Fabulous answer, Tim. So thank you for that. And I think what you're saying is communication, transparent communication. And the other thing is that, as you said, at the bottom of the pyramid, which holds up the whole structure, is the organization's reputation. And that, the organizations that we have here are, have done great work and have that history.
Mm-hmm.
So, anything else about the organization's reputation and how you present that during a crisis?
Yeah, I think that when I use the word reputation, we're talking pretty much about the CEO.
Mhm.
It goes there, and again, I'll tell a story. I had it was a nonprofit client, a big one, and they had I used it as an example earlier when I talked, but we had a CEO who embezzled from the organization, stole from it, had an apartment being paid for by the organization that nobody knew about, and did things at the apartment that were inappropriate. And so all this comes to light because somebody who knew about it called the New York Times and told them about it. And so uh, this is the CEO of the organization that is the problem. And once word gets out about that, because somebody already called the New York Times before we found out about it, then now you know that you have a reputation problem, but the reputation equal sign CEO. And so and I'll go on the flip side of a hypothetical, somebody accuses the CEO of something the CEO never said. But still the problem is right there at the CEO. So it's the reputation. That's the fundamental thing. In that case, my client was the board of trustees. And the board of trustees, we had to actually have secret meetings without the CEO until they fired the CEO. And then it became a legal issue. And then it was pretty complicated from that point of view. My part of it was, well, we have this New York Times reporter now covering this story, and we have our side of the story to tell, which was truthful. Here's what we learned, and we learned what you learned when you learned it, after you learned it, and here's what we're doing about it. And we're not denying it didn't happen, but we're trying to basically say the board wasn't on board with any of this, and we're trying to fix it. Well, they asked me to call the New York Times reporter and arrange a meeting to talk about this, and the New York Times reporter never returned me my call at all, and that's because he wanted that story and not our story. And so I was I was at a conference with another crisis communicator up in New York, and he handled this is funny that he handled the divorce between Ivanka Trump and Donald Trump, and his client was Ivanka Trump. And I remembered his story. We were talking. He was my, I wouldn't say idol, but as a crisis communicator, having the chance to meet him and talk to him for a while, I thought this is great. So I want to pick his brain. So we talked about stuff, and he told me about that. And he said, "Yeah, my client was Ivanka, and we had the New York Daily News, and he had the New York Post. I think it was like that, and they became our he used the word rag. That was our rag, and so we fed them dirt, and he was feeding dirt to the other paper, and the divorce was taking place in the papers. And so I found that entertaining and interesting. And he was talking about what he was thinking and doing when he was working on that. And so then when this happened, about 3 or 4 months later, I thought, well, the New York Times isn't giving us a fair shake here. They're not going to tell our side of the story. We all knew it. So I said, well, what if I call this other newspaper and tell them our side of the story? And they said, go for it. So I did. And the other paper ran with our story before the New York Times could get their story published. And our story was not pretty. It's not one that we wanted to talk about. We talked about the embezzlement. We talked about everything. It wasn't something we wanted to talk about, but at least it told our side of the story. And we didn't say, here's what you can ask us or whatever. They asked our chairperson all the tough questions, and we just figured it's kind of like ripping the Band-Aid off. Let's just get this out there so we don't have to answer later. And we did, and it happened, and it worked out that way. And the New York Times came out later, but they had to modify their coverage because we already broke the story. So, the moral of that whole thing with your question is, the CEO is the reputation of the organization, or the senior leadership team is the reputation of your organization. And even if they're not the problem or cause of the problem or related to the problem, if there's something that affects the reputation, it's going to translate right over to the CEO. It's contagious. So the CEO is going to have a personal reputation problem if the organization gets accused of things that are unethical or something like that.
Tim, it sounds like you've cleaned up some messes. I don't know. Well, we just want to say I just appreciate you so much today. And
Did I say Ivanka Trump? His wife was Ivana Trump, right? Yeah.
Ivana, that's
Yeah,
right.
his daughter's
Ivanka
Ivanka.
is
Yeah,
his
so it was
daughter.
Ivana. Yeah,
But there probably could be some
yeah.
New York Post, New York Times articles about that too. So, again, just thank you. I think it's been excellent. I think we all have things to think about. And, we don't want to have any of this, but it can be, we need to plan and think about what could possibly go on. But wanted to let you know that our next session for Nonprofit Leadership and Engagement Education series will be Thursday, May 7th at noon with Todd Papasergi, attorney, on advocacy, awareness, and action. Nonprofits can engage in advocacy and lobbying. Thanks to all those who participated in the session today. Thanks again to Tim for an outstanding presentation. If you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to me directly at the foundation, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Bravo, Tim.
Thank you very much.